Welcome back, everyone, and it's so good to see you there. We are back to Isaiah chapters 3 and 4. And after reading these chapters, weren't you just a little depressed? And oh my goodness, we just got started and things can't possibly get much worse. Well, oh yes, they can. We have spoken already the fact that almost everything in Isaiah is in response to a major crisis, an historical crisis, like a war, or moral crisis, like spiritual chaos. And today we get a quick glimpse of what happens when everything fails, from the very top right on down to the bottom. Bad leaders just keep getting worse, and no one is prepared to take the reins away from the bad leaders. And we'll certainly see some of this happen here in chapters 3 and 4. And actually, it just continues to happen almost throughout the 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah. So some people say that these chapters, which we will begin shortly, are actually part of a collection of sayings which probably come from the post-exilic period. And the whole point of these texts is that there's trouble in River City. Trouble with a capital J. Trouble in Judea. Trouble in Jerusalem. And we'll recognize some terms of trouble with which we will become very accustomed, like this term, the day of the Lord. Now, if you read any Amos, you've come across that term before. And last week we noticed the similarities between Isaiah and Micah. We just didn't know who spoke first, Isaiah or Micah. They're both complaining about the same sins. And today I think we're going to make similarities between Amos and Isaiah. Prophets sound like prophets, and they all should sound like God, since they're God's words that the prophets are speaking. So in these chapters, if you listen carefully, you'll definitely hear hints of Amos, particularly when it comes to women. And boy, can these two prophets complain about women, especially rich women. Now, I want to remind you that we've decided to walk through the book of Isaiah. So we'll have to take our time, because I'm not one of those big believers in doing the whole Bible in just 6 weeks. We'll get it all done. No, we won't. We need to walk slowly, especially with Isaiah. We don't have to rush, and that's a good thing, because the book of Isaiah is definitely, without a doubt, the longest and the most structurally difficult and the most complex book of the Hebrew Bible. And may I add that I think Isaiah is the most difficult book in either testament. So we're going to take our time and get to know the text, get to know Isaiah, feel comfortable. And please know what I'm presenting to you is my work. And I've been using many sources and commentaries, and I'd really like to know your opinion about this. This didn't come in a kit. We're getting to know each other. Many of us have been doing this together for 3 years almost. So feel free to let me know when you want to move on and when you want to slow down. So, we've just gotten started, so may I suggest that a way of keeping track of your questions, get a notebook and keep a list of all your questions. And then, as we walk through this book, record your answers. And I will venture a guess. I say that the answers to your questions will change depending on whom you are reading at a particular time. First, second, or third Isaiah, or any of the other Isaiahs that we're going to read. And of course, this will become even more difficult as we deal with the redactions, the redactors over the centuries. Now, I think we've chosen a marvelous book. But one thing I found very interesting in this long, complex book, and yes, you should keep track of everything, but listen to this. Surprising. Did you realize that the name of the prophet, Isaiah, is only mentioned 16 times in 66 books? In the entire book of Isaiah, the name Isaiah is only used 16 times. And we're going to talk a lot about this, but clearly, as the book is being edited, the editors or the redactors are trying very hard to depersonalize the prophet. So do you think that's a good thing? Sort of make him a man for all seasons, not tie him to any one king or any one area. But the prophet that we're reading about now, who we have been calling the first Isaiah, or the Isaiah of Jerusalem, probably dates to the period of the early 8th, 7th centuries. Hard to pin this guy down, but we'll talk more about this. And unlike his fellow prophets like Hosea and Amos, Isaiah seems to have the ear of the king. Some scholars claim that Isaiah may have been a member of the religious establishment. Maybe he was a priest at the temple in Jerusalem. And as we'll read on, I think you'll agree that Isaiah is a very well-educated man, and he's totally committed to the Davidic line and to the temple in Jerusalem as the place where God causes his name to dwell. Now, remember that I said all this, so it's all true, but you will see that Isaiah will condemn some kings, whether they're Davidic or not. If Isaiah doesn't think you're doing it right, you're going to hear about it. And probably the biggest thing that keeps Isaiah crazy is disobedience. The people of Judah and Jerusalem do not keep the covenant that they made with God. So they're going to have to face the consequences. And trust me, the consequences are costly. So, shall we start with Isaiah chapter 3? Now, for now, the sovereign, the Lord of hosts, is taking away from Jerusalem and from Judah. And now get ready for this long list. All the things that these two places are going to lose because they did not obey. Huge list. And they're really going to miss these things, Isaiah says. The sovereign of the Lord of hosts. That's what Isaiah calls God. And it makes God sound like an army general. And who is God leading, right? Who is God's army? Well, the hosts. And we all know the hosts. They're those crazy little angel army fighters in heaven who are like the SEAL team or the Rangers. Very capable fighters. And God is their commander. And here's what God tells Isaiah. Here's what Jerusalem and Judah are going to lose. First off, support and staff. No one is going to be working there, not in Jerusalem and not in Judah. And that's a good thing in a way, because you know what else they're going to lose? All their foodstuffs, like bread. And they're going to lose their water supply. So no one will be able to work there, since there will be nothing for anyone to eat or drink while they're there at work. And that wraps up everything, right? The end. No people, no supplies. But here's another list. Here's another list of the workers who will not be blessed to help you. Workers like warriors and soldiers and judges and prophets, the diviner and the elder. And we can keep going right on down the line. There will be no one left to help anyone. And how about those captains of 50? Who are those? Well, you know them. They're sort of like the half centurions. They lead a garrison of 50 men not 100 like centurions. Well, they'll all be gone. And all those honorable men they lead, every one of those 50, gone. And all those expert enchanters and the counselors and those skillful magicians, none of them will be left to help you. And those boys will be like princes, but they'll be really just kids who are acting like princes, which means babes shall rule over them. And it's interesting because Rashi says this will be the worst thing that can happen. The contempt and the hostility of the younger generation is deemed to be the worst curse that can come to a society. Now, do you agree with that? So, in a sense, the leadership goes first. And do you get this yet? You will be governed by weaklings who have no respect for leaders. All the old leaders will be dead, and you'll be governed by the young whippersnappers. Now, Isaiah didn't say that. I said that, but it's true. Your leaders will have no experience. They'll be motivated by wild impulses. So you'll be ruled by kids who will rule you by violence. Violently, like gangs or cartels. And this is not a nice vision. The people will be oppressed. Everyone will be oppressed by a neighbor. And those bratty kids, they will be insolent to the elders. And the base will insult the honorable. And no one will show respect for anyone. Now, does this sound familiar to anyone? But wait, there's more. There will be social disorder. People will be so concerned with themselves, no one will want to take charge. Someone will even seize a relative, like a member of the clan or mishpacha, saying, "Oh, look, you're wearing a cloak, a mantle, so you should be our leader." Now, a mantle is sort of like a law garment, maybe like a robe, a judge's robe. So if you own a robe, then this whole heap of ruins will be under thy hand. So no doubt about it, there will be chaos and degradation. But the other one will cry out saying, "I will not be a leader in my house. There is neither bread nor cloak, so you shall not make me a leader of the people." Nobody wants to be in charge. And now the text starts talking about proof of property, and it's confusing. And this will be all traced right back to moral disorder. Jerusalem has stumbled. Judah has fallen. All because of their speech and their deeds. The people of both places are to blame. Both are against the Lord, and everyone is provoking the Lord. So you know this can't be good. Just the look on their faces show us everything. One look at them and their faces themselves hears witness against themselves. So they even look guilty. They proclaim their sin like Sodom. They don't even try to hide it, for they have brought evil onto themselves. So maybe this happened a bit later than the time that this Isaiah is writing. Maybe about 100 years or so later. The Babylonians invaded Judah. So say the experts. This is probably a later insertion, but the message is the same. Things are disaster. Tell the innocent how fortunate they are, for they shall eat the fruit of their labors. And that's the only good thing Isaiah says. And now back to the woe. Woe to their soul. And now it's time for righteous indignation. Oh, woe to the guilty. Look at verse 11. How unfortunate they are for what their hands have done. Woe be done to them. My people, children are their oppressors. And now for the worst part. women. Women will rule over them. And what could be worse than that? Oh, my people, your leaders mislead you and confuse the course of your paths. And even worse, men will fall under the spell of women. And now we get all legalese again. Verse 13, the Lord rises to argue his case. God gets up. He actually stands up to judge the people. Notice, the Lord is on his feet like in a court of law. God rises to deliver the indictment, which includes taking advantage of the poor by enclosures, taking land away from individual owners, and making the people into indentured servants with no hope of ever owning personal property or being able to buy a home. So get ready. The Lord enters into judgment with the elders and the princes of his people. It is you who have devoured the vineyard. The spoil of the poor is in your houses. So can you see what they're doing? They're consolidating all the land, and they're making it impossible for the little guy to live on his own little piece of land. They're gathering it all up, little plot by little plot. And what do you think Isaiah means by saying, crushing my people, by grinding the face of the poor? Look at verse 15. Says the Lord, God of hosts. But now the Lord seems to have switched targets. He can do it, right? He's the Lord. He can switch around very easily. But catch this. Verse 16, the Lord says, because the daughters of Zion, and that would be the female inhabitants of Jerusalem, the women, because they are haughty, they're going to be in trouble, big trouble. Just look at them as they walk. Look at them. See how they walk, sticking out their necks, walking with outstretched necks, and they just glance from side to side with their eyes, wantonly looking right and left. And can you just hear them? Right? Listen very carefully. They are mincing as they go. They're tinkling or twinkling with their feet. So clearly they're wearing some kind of ankle bracelets or bells or something that's tinkling as they walk. And the Lord really hates this. The Lord will afflict all of their heads, all of these ladies of Zion. And the Lord will lay bare their secret paths. And oh Lord, doesn't this sound terrible? Who knows what they've been doing on those paths? And boy, oh boy, does the Lord have plans for you, ladies. Listen to this. On that day, the Lord will take away the finery on their ankles and their little crescents. Little crescents, they were like little pins in the shape of crescent moons that held their veils in place. And of course, God will take away all of your pendants and all your bracelets and all your scarves and all those cute little headdresses and all those armlets, more bracelets, and all those amulets, which are like feisty, idol-like things, and the signet rings gone, and the sashes, and the perfume boxes, and all the garments of gauze, probably Victoria's Secret stuff, and all the linen garments, and the turbans, and the veils. So can you just see these women? Isaiah thinks we can hear them and see them. Snooty women. And hardly anyone likes them, including John Calvin. He wrote a lot about this. He especially didn't like proud, tall women. You know, I wonder how tall Calvin really was, because being a tall woman around Calvin posed all kinds of problems for him. Tall women, Calvin said, had too much pride, which is, as we all know, the source of all evil. Don't you wonder if Calvin was a little on the short side? Well, this is how Calvin described a good woman. He said, "The only beauty that seduces me is the woman who is chaste, not fastidious, modest, thrifty, and patient, and a woman who will care about my health." Don't you just love men? Now, apparently he wasn't very well for a while, and he needed help. And I have to say, doesn't he sound very French? But French man, but back to God's decision to do what he has to do with the women of Zion. So you know what's going to happen. The Lord is going to give all these women head lice, which of course will lead to serious skin disease, and then they'll be covered in scabs, and then their foreheads will be bare. And that's awful. There'll be scabs in place of beauty. And didn't you just know that it's the women's fault? They take the blame. So now all their hair is going to fall out because they're tall and proud, and the text just keeps going on. And the Lord will take away all their beauty, and there will be nothing left except pomposity and pride. Don't the women get the worst of it? Calvin was absolutely right. But there are feminist scholars, one of whom is Suzanne Schultz, but there are plenty of others who say, just about that verse 17, that the text is not really describing the forehead or the scalp with lice. Actually, what the text is describing, say these scholars, is the female genitalia. Don't ask. And just so you know, this is scholarship, not my opinion. The text calls them secret parts, and that's what will be exposed, and everyone will see them. And we know what that means. That means sexual violence, abuse, and rape. Now, without the new linguistic look about scalps and vaginas, still look very carefully at verse 3:17. God will strike a scab on their heads and then lay bare their secret parts. That's awful. And there are commentators that say that God allows people to fully appreciate the sin that they enjoy. So God just gives up these women to their lusts. And that's a very nice God. But others say it's just like a parent. Back in the day, when a parent would catch their little one smoking, the parent decides to do just this, just what God decided to do. How does the parent punish the child for smoking? Well, he or she makes the child sit right down right in front of them and smoke a whole pack of cigarettes. That's not good parenting. And certainly it wasn't good of God to do that to us, right? The truth is, God tells Isaiah at least 22 fashion statements in this chapter in order to warn the women of Zion and us to straighten up and fly right. Like the women back in the day, like they were in charge of anything, right? But now everything is falling apart. So now they must listen. Instead of nice, pretty little perfume boxes, there will be stench. P-U, stinky poo stench. And some scholars say that the stench will be menstruation blood, which everyone knows is ritually impure and awful. And instead of wearing a pretty sash, the women will be wearing a rope. It sounds very harsh. And instead of having nicely designed hairdos, the women will all be bald. So to sum it up, instead of beauty, there will be shame. And I haven't even begun to discuss the undergarments. Too intimate. But take a moment to think about what texts, just like this, have meant to women throughout history. Women are dangerous and they're tempting. So they have to be covered and they have to keep their eyes down. And their hair has to be covered and their bodies too. And we will see over and over as we walk through these texts, we'll see those same rules. But for now, we can move from women to men. Look at verse 25. Your men shall fall by the sword, and all your warriors will be killed in battle. And the streets of the town, we're talking Jerusalem here, will have bodies stacked, one on top of the other, in the streets. And all the gates of the city will lament and mourn. And Jerusalem will be so ravaged. She'll just sit and mourn. She'll just sit in the street, on the ground, and mourn. And this is so sad. And the prophet is really, really tough on the future and on the ladies. Not only will their pomp turn into poverty, but also they will suffer terribly at the hands of the oppressors. That means rape and mutilation and murder, sexual abuse again. And interesting, because this kind of did happen. Isaiah prophesied around 740, 680, when Nebuchadnezzar was reigning and winning. And by 586, he had it done. Now you've heard of good old King Nebuchadnezzar. Well, this one is the second king. There was one before him. We think really, actually, he was one of the greatest kings of Babylonia, and he did a lot of good things, mostly in military matters. He conquered Syria and Palestine, and he was married, and his wife is actually named in Scripture and in the annals. His wife is named Amytis of Media. She's a Persian, and she was very helpful to the king. In fact, Amytis named, with her husband, they both worked together to design the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which, as we all know, is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But back to our history. The Babylonians defeat Judah and Jerusalem, and as we have seen, God really did take all of this away from them, one by one. Leadership and food and water. And then society begins to become divided, and a huge age group gap opens. What a mess. And of course, there are lots and lots of commentaries about this. Another one from John Calvin. John Calvin blames this whole thing on the Jews. It just doesn't matter how much they have, says Calvin. They always want more, and it will never stop. God's wrath will burn them up. This is just what we need now, right? Good old Calvin blaming the Jews like they don't have enough trouble with Isaiah and God now. So what a most depressing chapter so far. And many commentators say probably chapters 2 to 4, probably just a big collection of sayings. But get ready for more of this, more of the same. Now, I thought it was interesting that none of the scholars that I consulted could be sure if it were Isaiah or Micah who spoke first, and we talked about that. Whom is quoting whom? And many seem to think there's probably a third prophet who was spouting these words, who's independent of Isaiah and Micah. So we can see in chapter 3, verses 1 to 15, where we read threats against the rulers in Jerusalem. And then from verse 16 to 24, we hear all about the women of Jerusalem. And both of these deal with the day of Yahweh. And many scholars say that the text about women is difficult because we can't seem to figure out what is what exactly. So many say we're just guessing about the meaning of the text because the technical terms for women's finery is very confusing. But I sort of figured it out by reading the text, didn't you? And then in verse 25, how awful. That is an awful image of bodies just stacking up in the streets of Jerusalem with no one to move them or bury them. And doesn't it remind you of the European Black Death? And of course, all these finely dressed ladies will be captured and sold as slaves. Awful. Now, I'd like to spend just a quick minute or two on a scholarly topic you might not be aware of, and it's called studying the disabled in the Bible. The disabled study. It's called ableism, and we find plenty of it right here in these chapters. So think about this study like a whole new lens with which we can view the text. And I think we can see fairly easily in chapter 3, and in a moment we'll see it in chapter 4. Doesn't it seem as if the author, in this case, first Isaiah, portrays Judah and Jerusalem as a lame person? Can't walk, can't function. And the officials and the elite of the city are like a crutch that helps the city and the entire area to walk. Yet they're so bad now. They're being removed. And now the Judeans and those in Jerusalem will stumble and fall without the crutch. So for sure, these passages today associate disability with judgment against ineffective leadership. And we'll see this throughout the book of Isaiah. And this has become a huge area of biblical scholarship. And it offers us yet another way to look at how earlier communities grappled with God's presence within the difficulties of their human existence. And this is especially true with Isaiah, but he's not the only one. Disability imagery and metaphors undergird the text's visions of God's restoration of the community. And this is sort of a real modern image. Or is it? God made the world perfect, but problems have come into the world, and some call these problems sin. But in any case, no matter what we call the problem, it does seem to fit within the modern medical model of disability. Something is not functioning well. So in this text, Isaiah takes a city and disables it. And I promise we'll look through this lens more often as we continue this walk through Isaiah, ableism. But for now, let's get ready to read chapter 4. And this is a continuation of the 3rd chapter. And things do seem to get better, but certainly not right away. Here's the opening line of chapter 4. 7 women will take hold of one man. OMG. In those days, those horrible days, 7 women for every man. And listen to what each one of those women will say to that one guy. Oh, please, sir, just let us be called by your name. Oh, please, just take away our disgrace. Well, imagine being that guy. Now, do you get an idea exactly what each of these women is asking this guy? Now, of course, not everyone agrees with this, but some say that they're asking this guy to make them pregnant. Some scholars say they're more than willing to forego the support that's mandated by local law. Just impregnate us. That's all we want. to save us from barrenness, from being childless. So that doesn't sound so bad for those men. The women promised the guy, we'll eat our own bread and we'll wear our own clothes. So no need for you to do anything else. Just impregnate us. Just deposit your sperm. Just be a baby daddy. Just let us sort of be called by your name so that the baby will have a name. And that's absolutely awful, isn't it? But boy, oh boy, has this text produced some problems even today. Now, we've already sort of faced two major historical crises in this Isaiah text, and we're only in chapter 4, at the beginning of chapter 4. So just think, the day of the Lord, big deal, right? We've already faced two of these days. First, the Assyrians conquer the northern kingdom, Israel, and poof, they disperse the population. And then the invasion of the southern kingdom, Judah, by the Babylonians. And then we have the beginning of the Babylonian exile. And in both cases, we read about universal humiliation. Now, let me see if this example that I recently read about in a more modern post-war situation has anything to do with the Isaiah text we just read. And I'm talking about World War I. Now, at the end of World War I, there were 1 million Frenchmen dead. And there were 1 million German men dead. And there were 1/2 million Englishmen dead. And that's a lot of dead men. So, say some commentators, any hope of a woman trying to snare a man through seduction, that's also dead. No hope of even begging and pleading will not work. But women, even trying to do this, go against God's plan. Now, can you imagine that? One male among many women says that God will judge wicked women indirectly by allowing a slaughtering of males, thereby producing a shortage of husbands, which will, of course, punish the women. Because everyone knows this is all about women being punished by not having the rest and the peace and the refreshment that is marriage. Now, can you believe that? Honestly, does that sound even a little bit intelligent to you? Whoever wrote that is a lunatic, right? And trust me, there's more than one lunatic writing that. But how about this? When you all read this text in Isaiah, did you or any of you ever see the women as the church? Interesting. Have any of you ever heard that? Well, if you're a Revelation reader, you might. Now, I had never heard that, but for now, we'll go on this more in just a short time. But let's go back to Isaiah 4. And here we go again. On that day, the day of the Lord, the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be the pride and glory of the survivors of Israel. Well, yippee, right? Finally, some good news. On that day in the future, there will be hope, and it will come from the branch of the Lord. Now, do you remember? Who did the Lord promise his branch to? That is to say, his house to. Who did God say will rule on the throne forever and ever, will be an eternal throne forever? Well, that would be David. So we can reasonably be safe in assuming that the branch who's going to rule forever will come from the Davidic line, a ruler related to David. Now, is anybody getting any ideas about this? Well, many people think this is Jesus, because Jesus is related to David. But then there are many other scholars who think this is probably Zerubbabel, who is the grandson of Zeochin. Do you know Zerubbabel? Well, get ready for another new part of history. And maybe now, by chapter 4, the second verse, you can begin to see how very difficult the book of Isaiah can be historically. So apparently, here's the scoop. Briefly, Zerubbabel was one of the first to return to Israel after the exile. And he's the grandson of a king, and he comes back from the Babylonian exile after the Babylonians were defeated by Cyrus the Great of Persia. And it was Cyrus who invited the Jews to come back and rebuild the temple. So here, it seems, Isaiah is referring to a restored community. And do you remember Nehemiah? Well, he wrote an entire book of the Bible. He and his buddy, Ezra. The two of them rebuild the temple in Jerusalem with Zerubbabel's help. And this becomes the second temple period. So whoever's left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy, because the Lord has been recorded for life and dwelling in the city of Jerusalem. So anyone who stayed in Jerusalem will be declared holy too, as if anyone had a choice on who was going to stay in Jerusalem. Those who were left behind were probably the worst of the worst in terms of poverty. They were not deported out. They were not exiled by the Babylonians. So they stayed, and they tried so hard to hold on. So I guess in a sense, they were a surviving remnant, and God will count them as holy. So I guess in a sense, they are a holy remnant. And apparently their names are recorded in the book of Revelation. Now, I'm not sure because I never checked it. But now, as we slip into some more comforting verses, let's slip back into some fairly typical Isaiah talk. As soon as the Lord has washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and cleansed the bloodstains of Jerusalem in their midst by a spiritual judgment, by burning. So this disgusting filth has to be burned away. So we're going from gutter glory to complete transformation. Now, here we are talking about menstrual blood of the women of Jerusalem again, which is, of course, a symbol of their impurity. So it has to be burned away. Terrible. But there are other commentators who say, not so fast. This is not just about female blood that comes once a month. The word in this text can also refer to excrement. Can you believe that? So that has to be washed away too. And when the city is all spiffed up and clean, then in verse 5, the Lord will create over the whole site of Jerusalem, on top of Mount Zion, and over all the places of assembly, a cloud by day and smoke, along with the shining of a flaming light by night. Now, some commentators say that these smaller places, they will be smaller worship places, like synagogues. So a cloud by day and smoke, and a shining of a flaming fire by night. Well, those of us who walked together with Moses and the Israelites through the wilderness, we know this image for sure, right? It sounds very familiar. The cloud during the day, which will shield everyone from the hot sun, and at night, the fire to lead the people and to keep them warm during that cool desert night. So see, God never leaves the people. Not unless they're tall women wearing jewelry. But listen to the end of chapter 4. Indeed, over all the glory, there will be a canopy, and it will be like a pavilion, a shade by day from the heat, and a refuge and a shelter from the storm and the rain. So God will create a canopy. Now, has anyone ever been to a Jewish wedding? So what do those who are about to be married stand under? Well, they stand under a chuppah, a canopy. And God is building this now, but not for a Jewish wedding. No, this is all about God marrying the church. Now, did anyone see that here in the text? God is getting married to the church. So that means God's first wife, Israel, well, they went for the big D, and I don't mean Dallas. Jews out, Christians in, the end. Now, aren't you so happy to let these chapters go? But what did you think about that, right? The beginning, the middle, and the end. A little harsh on women. God is so not happy with the leadership, and we're going to talk more and more about this. But next week, we're going to read chapter 5, the song about the vineyard. And be sure to have a nice big glass of wine when you read it, because it's 30 verses long. So Shavua Tov, have a blessed week. God bless. Thank you all very much. I don't know how to turn it off.